The sun shone brightly over Los Angeles as Shaquille O'Neal stepped out of his car, dressed simply in jeans and a hoodie. The early morning air carried a sense of quiet energy, and the streets were already bustling with life. He adjusted his cap and took a deep breath, exuding the calm confidence that had defined his career. His towering frame moved smoothly as he walked down the sidewalk, his eyes scanning his surroundings with quiet curiosity. The luxury car dealership stood before him, its glass exterior reflecting the golden sunlight. Morrison's Auto Emporium was known for its exclusivity, a place where only the wealthiest clientele dared to step inside. The heavy glass doors slid open with a soft whoosh, revealing an opulent interior. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, marble floors gleamed beneath polished leather shoes, and an array of high-end vehicles sat on pristine platforms like museum exhibits. The scent of fresh leather and expensive cologne filled the air, reinforcing the exclusivity of the establishment. As Shaq stepped inside, conversations momentarily halted. Sharp eyes darted toward him, then quickly looked away, their owners pretending not to have noticed. His casual attire contrasted starkly with the refined elegance surrounding him, and it was clear from the slight stiffening of shoulders and raised eyebrows that he was not expected in such a place. A salesman, young and impeccably dressed, was the first to approach. His name tag read, Josh. His polite smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and his tone was laced with skepticism. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice careful, as though measuring whether this stranger was worth his time. Shaq's gaze wandered past him, landing on a vintage car displayed in a secluded section of the showroom. Its deep black paint gleamed under the spotlights, and its elegant curves spoke of an era long past. "That one," Shaq said, his voice even. "What model is it?" Josh barely suppressed a sigh. 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. One of the rarest classics in existence. His tone carried an air of dismissiveness, as if he had already decided that the conversation would lead nowhere. "It's not for just anyone." Shaq nodded, stepping closer to admire the craftsmanship. His fingers hovered just above the polished hood, appreciating the timeless beauty without touching. Meanwhile, hushed voices whispered from different corners of the room. "What's he doing here? Probably just looking. No way he's buying." The murmurs were low, but not low enough. Shaq was used to judgment, had faced it in many forms throughout his life, but it never ceased to amuse him. He let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head slightly. Just then, a new presence made itself known. Richard Morrison, the dealership's owner, had been observing from a distance. A man of precision and calculation, he approached with measured steps, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. His tailored suit fit like a second skin, and his smile was polite but devoid of warmth. He stopped just short of Shaq, hands clasped behind his back. "Good morning," he said, his tone smooth but firm. "I see you have an eye for fine automobiles." Shaq met his gaze, unbothered by the scrutiny. "Morning. Yeah, this one caught my attention." Richard's eyes flickered briefly toward Josh before returning to Shaq. "Indeed, it's a remarkable piece. Quite rare and, of course, quite expensive." The emphasis was clear, a subtle challenge masked as an innocent remark. Shaq merely nodded, his expression neutral. "How much?" Richard's smirk deepened. "Several million, depending on the final appraisal. It's not typically something we expect casual buyers to inquire about." Shaq let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "You always size up customers like this?" he asked, his tone neither offended nor confrontational, simply curious. Richard tilted his head slightly, feigning contemplation. "We cater to a very particular clientele," he replied. "Exclusivity is part of our brand." Shaq nodded thoughtfully. Then, with an easy motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. A few taps later, he turned the screen toward Richard, revealing a live bank statement with a balance that made Josh visibly pale. Richard's smile faltered for the first time. The atmosphere shifted, tension replacing skepticism. The whispers that had been murmuring around the room abruptly stopped. "I'll take it," Shaq said simply. "Cash." Josh swallowed hard, suddenly looking anywhere but at Shaq. Richard, ever the businessman, recovered quickly. "Of course, sir," he said, his voice now lined with practiced enthusiasm. "Would you like to arrange delivery, or?" "No need," Shaq interrupted. "I'll drive it out myself." Within moments, the energy in the showroom had transformed. Employees who had ignored Shaq earlier now moved quickly to facilitate the transaction. Papers were drawn up, signatures exchanged, and the keys to the Rolls-Royce placed in Shaq's large hand. As he settled into the driver's seat, the vintage leather creaked slightly under his weight. He ran his fingers over the wooden steering wheel, feeling the history embedded within. With a deep breath, he turned the ignition, and the powerful engine purred to life. Rolling down the window, Shaq glanced back at Richard and Josh, both of whom now stood stiffly, their earlier condescension replaced with uncomfortable silence. He flashed a grin. Lesson of the day: never judge a book by its cover. And with that, he eased the car forward, its tires gliding smoothly over the pristine showroom floor before disappearing into the sunlit streets of Los Angeles. The dealership remained silent for several beats, until finally, a single voice broke through the quiet. That was Shaquille O'Neal. Richard let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, while Josh simply stared at the empty space where the Rolls-Royce had once sat. Outside, Shaq drove through the city, the warm breeze brushing against his face. His smile was one of quiet satisfaction, not because he had made a statement, but because he had stayed true to himself. In the end, he didn't need validation. Just a good car and a great story to go with it. Shaq's voice was steady, his expression composed, but there was a glint of something unreadable in his eyes. Richard, however, remained unimpressed, his lips curling in a faint smirk as he crossed his arms. The opulence of the showroom gleamed around them, polished floors reflecting the glow of crystal chandeliers. In the center, standing like a monument to history, was the 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, its deep metallic sheen unmarred by time. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, taking a measured breath before speaking. "This isn't the kind of car just anyone can purchase," he said, his voice carrying an almost performative patience. "It requires a certain level of appreciation, and, of course, financial backing." Shaq remained unfazed. He had encountered this type of subtle condescension before, and he had learned long ago that the best response was unwavering confidence. He tilted his head slightly. "I understand that completely. I wouldn't be here if I weren't serious." Richard exhaled through his nose, his smirk widening ever so slightly. He turned to Josh, the young salesman standing nearby, and gestured lazily toward him. "Josh, why don't you give our guest the details?" The command had the weight of an order, but also a dismissal. Josh, reluctant but obedient, cleared his throat. "Of course, sir," he said, stepping closer to the car. "This is one of the most coveted vintage automobiles in the world. The 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost is a masterpiece of craftsmanship, featuring an original engine, handcrafted leather interiors, and a chassis built to outlast generations." Shaq listened attentively, nodding. "Original engine?" he asked, his tone thoughtful. "How well does it run?" Josh hesitated for a second before letting out a small chuckle, one devoid of humor. "Run well," he echoed. "This isn't the type of car you buy for Sunday drives. It's a collector's piece. An investment, really." Shaq smiled faintly. "Interesting. And the price?" Josh's mouth twitched. He shot a glance at Richard before replying, "That's something you'd have to discuss with the manager." He turned on his heel and walked away, but instead of fetching Richard, he sauntered toward a small group of employees standing near the reception desk. Shaq caught the low whispers, the sidelong glances, the barely stifled snickers. "Look at his clothes. Does he really think he can afford that? Probably just here to take pictures and pretend he's shopping." The words were meant to be overheard, thinly veiled insults disguised as casual conversation. Shaq remained still, his expression betraying nothing. The silence between him and the car seemed louder than the murmurs behind him. The weight of the stairs pressed against his back, but he ignored them, keeping his focus locked on the Silver Ghost. Richard observed the exchange with detached amusement, his arms still crossed. He had seen this scenario play out before. A man walks into his showroom, dazzled by the luxury, indulging in the fantasy that he belongs. He lets them dream for a while, lets them taste the illusion before they realize the inevitable truth: this world was not theirs. But Shaq did not flinch. His silence carried a different energy, something Richard couldn't quite place. Instead of shifting uncomfortably or lashing out, Shaq remained composed, examining the car as if he were the only one in the room. The confidence unsettled Richard more than he cared to admit. Richard finally stepped forward, his shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. He stopped just beside Shaq, exuding an air of casual authority. "You seem quite taken with this car," he mused, his tone bordering on indulgent mockery. Shaq turned to him with an unreadable expression. "That's because it's a masterpiece," he said simply. Richard tilted his head, observing Shaq as one might study an abstract painting, searching for meaning in the brushstrokes. "It is," he agreed. "But not everyone who admires art can afford to own it." Shaq smiled, slow and deliberate. "That's true," he said. "But I'm not just here to admire." For the first time, Richard hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, but Shaq caught it. The rhythm of the conversation had shifted, the balance of control tipping. Richard had expected Shaq to either shrink under the weight of implied judgment or lash out in defensive indignation. He had expected embarrassment, anger, even frustration. What he had not expected was this unwavering poise. Richard cleared his throat, straightening slightly. "You mentioned you're interested in purchasing it." "Yes. Are you aware of the price?" "I am." Richard's lips pursed. "And you still believe this car is within your reach?" Shaq's smile didn't waver. "I don't believe. I know." For the first time, Richard felt something unfamiliar creep into his chest. Not doubt, not exactly, but an uneasy awareness that he had miscalculated. He glanced toward the reception area, where Josh and the other employees had fallen into an uncomfortable silence, their whispers fading as they realized that this wasn't unfolding as they had anticipated. Richard adjusted his stance, exhaling slowly. He had built a career on assessing people, on understanding who was worth his time and who wasn't. But Shaq did not fit neatly into any of the categories he relied on. His presence demanded an adjustment, a recalibration. Richard nodded slowly. "Very well," he said, his voice measured. "Let me get you the details." Shaq nodded, offering nothing more. Richard turned sharply, walking toward his office, his mind already working through a series of questions he hadn't expected to ask today. The silver ghost stood between them, polished to perfection, timeless in its grandeur. And Shaq remained exactly where he was, standing tall, unshaken, as if he had always belonged there. On his heel and signaled for Josh to bring additional information, a faint inscrutable smile played on his lips as though the real game had only just begun. Shaq remained where he was, his gaze shifting back to the Rolls-Royce, but the atmosphere around him had changed. The weight of condescension and judgment hung in the air, palpable yet unable to sway him. He knew he stood in a place where respect was not easily given, but that wouldn't stop him from getting what he wanted. Richard returned after reviewing some documents. In his hand was a thin file on the 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, but his demeanor remained unchanged, a smugness and concealed contempt hidden behind a light smile. He placed the file on a nearby glass table and looked at Shaq with an expression that was half challenging, half mocking. "You know," Richard began, his voice drawn out as if emphasizing every word, "this car isn't just a means of transportation. It's a symbol of success, of class. Very few people get the opportunity to own one, and often those who dare to dream about it don't truly understand what it represents." Shaq, maintaining a calm demeanor, stepped closer to the table. He glanced at the file but didn't touch it. "I understand your point," he said, his voice deep but steady. "I know the value of a classic car like this. I'm not here to dream. I'm here to buy." Shaq's response drew a slight chuckle from Richard, though it was anything but genuine. "You're serious?" Richard asked, his tone growing sharper. "Let me make this clear. This car is worth as much as a luxury estate in Beverly Hills. It's not something just anyone can consider buying. It takes more than curiosity and a bit of courage to walk into a dealership." Shaq met Richard's gaze, his eyes resolute. "I understand that very well," he replied, his tone still composed. "But I don't believe a person's worth is measured by what they wear or how they enter a room." Richard was silent for a moment, though his eyes betrayed his displeasure. He stepped closer to Shaq, deliberately lowering his voice to add an edge of intimidation. "You know," he said almost in a whisper, "I've met a lot of people like you. They walk in here with big hopes, dreaming they can touch something they'll never truly reach. I hate to break it to them, but that dream usually ends the moment they hear the real number." Shaq narrowed his eyes slightly and tilted his head as if to confirm he'd heard correctly. "A dream," he repeated, his voice low but carrying an unexpected weight. "You think I'm here to dream?" Richard folded his arms, smirking dismissively. I don't think. I know. Those who can truly afford it don't need to talk so much. They let their actions speak for them. And honestly, you don't strike me as that kind of person. Shaq remained silent for a few seconds, looking at Richard not with anger but with an expression of quiet disappointment. He was used to being judged by appearances, but it never ceased to sadden him. He sighed softly and spoke, his voice calm yet powerful. Mr. Morrison, I don't know what kind of people you've encountered before, but one thing I'm sure of, judging a person by their appearance is never accurate. It often says more about the one doing the judging than about the person being judged. Shaq's words landed like an unexpected blow, causing Richard to stiffen momentarily, but he quickly regained his composure, attempting to mask his discomfort with a smug grin. Perhaps you're right, he said, though his tone remained laced with sarcasm. But I've worked here long enough to recognize who's a serious buyer and who's just looking for a moment in a world they don't belong to. Shaq shrugged, a faint smile flickering across his face. Maybe so. But the world I belong to isn't defined by a car or a dealership. It's defined by how I treat others and how they choose to treat me. Richard was momentarily speechless, unsure how to respond. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the distant sounds of employees and customers in the background. Yet even in that silence, the tension between the two was palpable. Shaq stood tall, his gaze unwavering, while Richard, though he wouldn't admit it, felt the quiet strength radiating from Shaq, a strength not born of wealth or status, but of character. Richard let out a faint, dismissive laugh and stepped back. I'll leave you to spend more time with the car, he said, though his tone betrayed his skepticism. If you need anything else, just let me know. Shaq said nothing. Giving a slight nod, he turned back to the car, his expression still carrying a trace of disappointment. He hadn't come here to argue or prove a point. He simply wanted to find something meaningful. But with every word Richard spoke, it became increasingly clear that arrogance and prejudice were still deeply rooted in this world. Even so, Shaq refused to let it dishearten him. He knew that in the end, actions would speak louder than words. Shaq remained by the 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, his eyes tracing the elegant curves of the car, though his mind was consumed by Richard's biting words. The air around him grew heavier as Richard returned, his demeanor now firmer, his steps more decisive than before. Richard stopped just a few paces away, arms crossed over his chest, his stance exuding dominance. An awkward silence lingered between them before he finally spoke, his voice cold and laced with challenge. Sir, I believe it's time we cut to the chase, Richard began, each word deliberate, as if to back Shaq into a corner. This is not a place for people to admire or fantasize about things far beyond their reach. Shaq looked up, his gaze steady but with a flicker of disappointment. He said nothing, merely holding Richard's stare, waiting for him to continue. Richard took another step closer, closing the distance so that he was nearly face to face with Shaq. You know, he said, lowering his voice but failing to mask his contempt, my time and my staff's time here is extremely valuable. Frankly, I don't appreciate it being wasted by someone with no real intent. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing just a touch. You think I'm wasting your time? He asked, his tone calm yet weighted. Richard shrugged, a smirk playing on his lips. It's not a thought. It's a fact, he retorted sharply. This dealership caters to those who can afford it, and quite honestly, given your attire and demeanor, I don't think you understand the real value of what's here. Richard's words echoed in the now quiet showroom, drawing the subtle attention of nearby staff and customers. A few stole quick glances but lacked the courage to intervene. The atmosphere thickened, bordering on oppressive as Richard's voice grew louder. Shaq remained rooted, unyielding in the face of Richard's aggression. He took a deep breath, releasing it slowly as if reining in the storm brewing within. When he spoke, his voice was clear and composed. Respect, Mr. Morrison, Shaq said, emphasizing each word, is a luxury anyone can afford if they truly want to. The weight of the moment pressed heavily between them, an invisible tension crackling in the air like static before a storm. Shaq's words had landed with the force of a hammer blow, shattering the fragile veneer of the encounter and exposing the raw truth beneath. Richard, for the first time in a long while, found himself at a loss. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came forth. Silence settled like dust in the showroom, thick and heavy, suffocating in its intensity. Richard's hands clenched at his sides, his knuckles widening as he struggled to regain his composure. But Shaq had already seen the flicker of vulnerability beneath the mask of arrogance. He had seen the momentary hesitation, the way Richard's breath hitched just slightly, betraying the inner turmoil he was trying so desperately to suppress. Shaq didn't revel in it, didn't seek to humiliate the man further. Instead, he simply held his ground, his presence unwavering, his resolve unshaken. "You talk a lot about power, Mr. Morrison," Shaq continued, his voice a measured calm that carried effortlessly through the hushed space. "About who belongs and who doesn't. But power isn't found in titles or wealth. It's not about standing in a room full of expensive cars and thinking that makes you superior. Real power is in how you treat others. It's in respect. And that, it seems, is something you've never truly understood." Richard flinched. Just barely, but it was enough. Shaq had hit a nerve. The manager's carefully constructed image was crumbling at the edges, unraveling before everyone's eyes. The employees who had once followed his lead now shifted uncomfortably, their gazes darting between the two men. Customers who had previously admired the showroom's pristine displays now found their attention drawn elsewhere, to the uncomfortable reality of the confrontation unfolding before them. Still, Richard refused to let go of his pride. He forced a smirk, though it barely held. "You think a little speech changes anything?" he sneered, though the bite in his words had dulled. "You think walking in here, throwing around some righteous nonsense, makes you better than me?" Shaq exhaled slowly, almost pitying the man before him. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to engage in a battle of egos. The truth was already out in the open, undeniable and unyielding. He took a step back, his movements deliberate and composed, giving Richard space to wrestle with his own conscience, or lack thereof. "I don't need to be better than you," Shaq said finally. "That was never the point. I came here expecting to see excellence. Instead, I found arrogance. And that's the real shame." With that, Shaq turned, his footsteps echoing in the vast, opulent space as he made his way toward the large glass doors. The sun outside was bright, casting his towering silhouette in stark contrast as he pushed the doors open and stepped into the world beyond. For a moment, the dealership remained frozen in the wake of his departure. Then, slowly, movement resumed. Employees shifted uncomfortably, murmurs spreading like ripples through the showroom. Some exchanged glances, silently questioning everything they had once taken as fact. Others looked to Richard, waiting to see how he would react. But the manager simply stood there, his hands still clenched, his jaw tight, his mind racing in a way he hadn't anticipated. Then, a new sound broke through the murmur, a sharp, deliberate tapping of shoes against the polished floor. Someone was moving, purposefully. It was Ethan, a young man who had been watching from the sidelines, phone in hand. He had captured everything: the tension, the exchange, the moment of reckoning. And now, his fingers moved swiftly, uploading the footage before Richard even noticed. The video hit the internet like wildfire. Within hours, it spread across social media platforms. The title was simple but compelling: "When Power Meets True Strength." Comments flooded in, dissecting every detail, every word, every reaction. Some people praised Shaq's restraint, his refusal to stoop to anger. Others condemned Richard's behavior, calling him out for his arrogance. Hashtags like #RespectIsLuxury and #LessonLearned began trending. News outlets picked up the story, dissecting the video frame by frame, analyzing the deeper implications behind the confrontation. Richard had unwittingly become the face of everything wrong with elitism, a cautionary tale wrapped in a viral moment. Customers began calling the dealership, not to inquire about cars, but to question its values. Longtime clients voiced their disappointment. Employees, emboldened by Shaq's words, started murmuring about the toxic culture they had endured under Richard's leadership. Some even considered quitting. Meanwhile, Shaq remained unaware of the social media storm he had ignited. He had walked away without looking back, without needing validation. He had said what needed to be said, and that was enough. But as he stepped into his own vehicle, a message popped up on his phone. A friend had sent him the video, the caption simple yet powerful: "You just changed the game." Shaq watched for a moment, saw his own figure standing tall while Richard fumed in frustration. He saw the way the employees had looked at him, not with fear, but with something closer to admiration. And then, with a small, knowing smile, he put his phone away and drove off, leaving the past behind him. Back at the dealership, Richard sat in his office, staring at his own reflection in the darkened computer screen. His phone buzzed endlessly, calls from corporate, messages from colleagues, emails that all seemed to blur together. He knew the fallout was inevitable. He knew that his actions had finally caught up with him. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what came next. The reaction toward Richard and the dealership's treatment of Shaquille O'Neal was intense, sparking disbelief and outrage. Many couldn't fathom how Richard dared to disrespect someone of Shaq's stature. The arrogance he displayed disgusted people across the internet. Why judge someone based on appearances? Shaq, known for his patience, dignity, and legendary status, demonstrated a level of composure that resonated deeply with people. His words should be a golden standard in every luxury car dealership. Yet, the reaction wasn't purely negative. The incident ignited discussions about respect, prejudice, and human decency. Shaq's calm yet powerful response quickly became an inspirational mantra, circulating through memes, social media posts, and even news headlines. People echoed his sentiment. Respect doesn't come from power or wealth but from how one treats others. Major media outlets picked up the story, drawing widespread attention. Headlines like, "Shaquille O'Neal's lesson in respect at a luxury dealership," appeared across various publications. A particularly striking piece in the New York Times observed that in a world where status often determines how people are treated, Shaq's response served as a reminder that respect is a fundamental right, not a privilege. While Shaq became a symbol of humility and grace, the backlash against Richard and Morrison's Auto Emporium was swift and unforgiving. The dealership's social media accounts were inundated with thousands of negative comments. Customers vowed never to return, calling for Richard to be held accountable. The controversy reached a point where Morrison's Auto Emporium's parent company had no choice but to respond. Within days, they issued an official statement expressing regret over Shaq's experience and promising to implement changes to ensure all customers receive the respect they deserve. However, the apology rang hollow for many. It did little to repair the damage. Sales plummeted, customers canceled their purchases, and the dealership's once spotless reputation was in tatters. Richard faced the brunt of the fallout. His suspension was announced publicly, but it did little to quell the outrage. The public wanted more than a corporate apology, they demanded accountability. Despite the viral storm, Shaq chose to remain silent. His actions and words had already made an impact, and there was no need to add more fuel to the fire. Yet, his demeanor during the incident only strengthened the admiration people had for him. He wasn't just a basketball icon. He became an example of patience, dignity, and resilience. His response to prejudice and arrogance transformed a negative situation into a powerful life lesson. As the video continued circulating, Morrison's Auto Emporium suffered devastating losses. The dealership, once known for catering to high-profile clients, was now infamous for arrogance and poor customer service. The backlash wasn't limited to customers, even major business partners distanced themselves from the dealership. Exclusive car clubs and elite organizations severed ties, unwilling to associate with a brand tarnished by scandal. Among the most vocal critics was a wealthy entrepreneur who had been a longtime client of Morrison's. He publicly announced he would never set foot in the dealership again. His statement, shared on social media, gained traction. If they can't respect Shaquille O'Neal, how can they be trusted to respect any of their customers? Former employees of Morrison's Auto Emporium soon came forward, shedding light on Richard's long-standing behavior. Some recounted instances where Richard had treated other customers unfairly, based solely on their appearance or perceived financial status. An anonymous source described him as someone who only valued people he believed could boost the dealership's prestige. Another former employee openly shared on LinkedIn that Richard's arrogance wasn't new. It had been an issue for years, but no one had spoken up due to fear of losing their job. The growing number of revelations only deepened the scandal. More people began demanding action, calling for the dealership to take real steps beyond empty apologies. Morrison's Auto Emporium, buckling under the weight of negative publicity, announced a temporary closure for restructuring. The sign on their showroom was taken down, and employees either resigned or were dismissed. Richard, once a powerful figure within the dealership, was indefinitely suspended, facing the possibility of permanent removal. The downfall of Morrison's Auto Emporium was swift. A brand that once prided itself on exclusivity now found itself struggling to salvage any credibility. Branches in other cities reported declining sales, as customers across the country refused to support a dealership tied to such a widely publicized scandal. The damage to their reputation was irreversible. Meanwhile, the core lesson left behind by Shaq's handling of the situation continued to spread. His words became a rallying cry for fairness and respect. People began expecting businesses to uphold those values, regardless of their industry. The incident was no longer just about a single dealership's downfall. It was about a shift in how people viewed customer service and human decency. Shaq himself didn't dwell on the controversy. He was never one to seek unnecessary drama or revel in someone else's failure. To him, what mattered most was turning a negative encounter into a meaningful lesson. A few days later, he quietly visited another dealership, one that didn't boast extravagant decor or exclusive clientele. Instead, this place radiated warmth and sincerity, run by people who treated customers with genuine respect. There, he made his purchase, knowing he was supporting a business that valued people over appearances. As time passed, the viral storm gradually faded, but the lesson remained. Shaq had turned a moment of disrespect into a profound message that resonated far beyond the world of luxury cars. It wasn't just about who he was, it was about the way he showed the world that true respect isn't earned through wealth or power. It's given through how we treat others, regardless of status or perception. Classic cars stood in neat rows, gleaming under the warm afternoon sun, their chrome accents reflecting the golden light. A rustic wooden sign swayed gently at the entrance, creaking softly in the breeze. As Shaq pushed open the heavy wooden door, a small bell jingled, announcing his arrival. Behind the counter, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a weathered smile looked up, immediately stepping away from his desk. Despite Shaq's towering presence, there was no flicker of intimidation or recognition, just a welcoming nod. "Welcome to Sam's Classic Auto," the man greeted, his voice steady and kind. "I'm Sam. What can I do for you today?" Shaq extended his hand, his large fingers nearly engulfing Sam's firm grip. A small smile crossed his lips as he replied, "I'm looking for something special. A classic car. Not just something that looks good but has a real story behind it." Sam's eyes twinkled as he nodded knowingly. "You've come to the right place. Every car here has a soul. Let me show you around." Walking through the lot, Sam spoke with a passion that brought each vehicle to life. Every car had history woven into its leather seats, every dent and polish carrying whispers of the past. Shaq listened intently, fascinated not just by the vehicles but by Sam's deep knowledge and respect for their stories. There was no pressure, no rehearsed sales pitch, just an honest love for classic automobiles. Eventually, they stopped in front of a 1959 Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz, its sleek black body shimmering as the sun kissed its polished surface. The red leather interior contrasted dramatically against the deep, dark exterior, exuding timeless elegance. Sam rested a gentle hand on the hood. This one belonged to a jazz musician, a man who traveled across the country playing in small clubs, inspiring people from all walks of life. He called it his freedom ride. Shaq stepped closer, drawn in by the story and the car's undeniable character. He ran his fingers along the pristine frame, absorbing its essence. "This," he said, voice firm, "is exactly what I'm looking for." Unlike the impersonal, dismissive experience he had encountered elsewhere, Sam handled the buying process with professionalism and care. He broke down the price, explained the car's condition, and walked through potential restoration work that would maintain its authenticity. There was no arrogance, no condescension, just a mutual respect between two men who appreciated the significance of history and craftsmanship. Once the deal was finalized, Shaq posed for a photo with Sam and his small team, their smiles genuine and unforced. Later, Shaq posted the image to social media with a simple caption: "True luxury is being treated with respect. Thank you, Sam, and your team, for reminding me of that." The post spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about Shaq's fame, it was about the message behind his words. Fans and strangers alike resonated with the sentiment, praising not just Shaq's humility but Sam's integrity as a businessman. The story of Sam's Classic Auto, once a small dealership known only to a handful of enthusiasts, reached people far beyond its modest roots. Customers began arriving from distant states, eager not just to purchase a vehicle but to experience the sincerity and respect that had become the hallmark of the shop. Shaq didn't stop there. Inspired by the meaning behind the Cadillac, he decided to use it for a cause close to his heart. The car underwent a meticulous restoration, each detail preserved to honor its history. When it was ready, he arranged for it to be auctioned at a prestigious event, the proceeds earmarked for community programs focused on education, equality, and opportunity. The night of the auction, Shaq took to the stage, addressing an audience filled with collectors, philanthropists, and supporters. He gestured toward the Cadillac, its presence commanding attention. "This car is more than metal and leather," he said. "It's a reminder that we change the world not with wealth or fame, but with how we treat each other. That's the real definition of luxury." The bidding war that followed was fierce, and when the final hammer fell, the amount raised far exceeded expectations. Every dollar was funneled into organizations making real change, ensuring that the Cadillac's legacy would continue long after it left the showroom floor. But the impact of Shaq's message didn't end there. The phrase he had casually coined in his post, "True luxury is being treated with respect," sparked a global movement. Social media erupted with discussions about dignity, fairness, and the treatment of customers in high-end industries. The hashtag respect is luxury trended across multiple platforms, with people sharing their own experiences of discrimination and kindness. Luxury brands took notice. Rolls-Royce released a statement reinforcing the value of respect in customer service, writing, "Luxury is not just about what we create, it's about how we treat those who appreciate it. Thank you, Shaquille O'Neal, for the reminder." Gucci followed suit, launching a campaign titled, "Respect is Timeless," highlighting inclusivity and equal treatment in the fashion industry. Other major companies quickly adapted, reassessing their customer policies and corporate values to align with the growing demand for fairness and integrity. Beyond the world of luxury, Shaq's story resonated on a deeply human level. A woman in New York shared her experience of being ignored at an upscale boutique simply because she wasn't dressed the part. "Shaq's story reminds me that respect should never be conditional," she wrote. A taxi driver in Mumbai posted a photo of himself, captioned, "I drive all kinds of people, but I always treat them the same. Respect doesn't need wealth, it needs heart." Industries took note. Automotive dealerships began implementing new training programs focused on professionalism and courtesy. Hospitality giants introduced diversity and inclusion initiatives, ensuring guests were welcomed with genuine respect regardless of their appearance or status. The conversation expanded beyond commerce, touching on deeper issues of bias and societal perception. Through it all, Shaq remained humble, using his platform not to seek recognition but to amplify the voices of those affected by the movement. He attended community discussions, supported local businesses that upheld ethical values, and continued his philanthropic efforts with renewed purpose. His name, once synonymous only with basketball dominance, became equally tied to the ideals of integrity and dignity. The Cadillac Eldorado, now resting in the hands of its new owner, continued to carry its story forward, a symbol of not just a jazz musician's journey, but of a movement that transcended generations. And in the quiet lot of Sam's Classic Auto, where the sun still glinted off polished hoods and the bell still jingled above the wooden door, respect remained the true currency of business, proving that luxury, in its purest form, is never just about what we own, but how we are treated along the way. One of Shaquille O'Neal's most powerful moments came not on the basketball court but at an auction house, where his words about respect resonated across the world. The quote from the event, "Respect has no price, but when you give it, it creates immeasurable value," became more than just a statement, it became a movement. T-shirts, posters, and billboards carried his message, emphasizing the importance of dignity and kindness. What started as a simple visit to a car dealership turned into a global call for change, reminding everyone that respect and equality should never be conditional. For Shaq, the 1959 Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz was more than just a classic car, it was a symbol of something greater. Purchased from Sam's Classic Auto, the vehicle carried with it a story of transformation. Shaq decided that instead of keeping it in his collection, he would auction it, with every cent going toward charities focused on education, community development, and social inclusion. His goal was to turn a moment of negativity into something that could uplift countless lives. The auction was held in a grand yet inviting venue, its soft golden lighting reflecting off the Cadillac's pristine body. The audience was not just composed of car enthusiasts but also philanthropists, activists, and everyday fans who had been touched by Shaq's story. When Shaq walked onto the stage, his sheer presence commanded attention. The room fell silent as he took the microphone, scanning the audience with a gaze filled with purpose. This car, he began, his deep voice filling the space, is not just about horsepower or luxury. It's about how we choose to treat each other. How we can turn a negative moment into an opportunity to build something better. He paused, letting his words sink in. Respect doesn't cost a dime, but it is the most valuable thing we can offer one another. It's not reserved for the rich or powerful, it belongs to everyone. And when we give it freely, we lift not only others but ourselves as well. For a brief moment, the crowd was still, absorbing the weight of his words. Then, a wave of applause swept through the room, not just as appreciation but as an acknowledgement of a universal truth. The auction commenced, and the bidding was fierce. Hands shot up as the numbers climbed higher and higher, the energy becoming electric. Each bid was not just for a car. It was for the story, the message, and the change that it represented. The final bid came in at an astonishing $5 million, exceeding all expectations. The winning bidder, a renowned collector, announced plans to display the Cadillac in an automotive museum, ensuring that Shaq's story would be preserved for future generations. The entire auction's proceeds went directly to carefully chosen charitable causes, funding education initiatives, community building projects, and awareness campaigns about respect and equality. As the event wrapped up, media outlets picked up the story, amplifying Shaq's message. His quote, "Respect doesn't cost a dime, but when you give it, it creates a measurable value," appeared in headlines worldwide. It wasn't just an inspiring moment, it was a movement that had taken root. Beyond the glitz of the auction and the headlines, the impact was tangible. Underprivileged children gained access to education, communities received resources to build better futures, and conversations about dignity and respect took center stage. Shaq's decision to turn a single incident into a force for good was proof that small actions, when fueled by the right intentions, could create waves of change. When asked about the overwhelming success of the auction, Shaq simply smiled and said, "This isn't about me. It's about what we can do together. When we choose to respect and uplift each other, we make the world a better place." The legacy of this event went far beyond a single night. It became a reminder that respect is a currency we all hold and can spend freely. In a world often divided by status, wealth, and appearances, Shaq's story stood as proof that the simplest gestures, kindness, dignity, and respect, hold the power to bridge the deepest divides. And as people continued to share and embrace his message, it became clear that the impact of this moment would resonate for generations to come.